Larry Fink's letter to CEOs. Always interesting because he's the largest money manager. He has a say in how Zeitgeist is formed. He was the one who started the ESG movement. And now he's talking about the end of globalization as we know it. So I want to talk about this letter and the implications for us. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And this is a good example of an influence that we need to take seriously. So for anybody who's out there interested in running money, in investing as a hedge fund manager or something along those lines, they need to pay attention to such developments, such as, for example, when there is a change in zeitgeist. I once had the opportunity to attend a presentation by Michael Milken, who's a bit of a controversial figure from the 1980s. He created the junk bond market. And I think no matter what, he's I would say, first and foremost, an incredibly intelligent person, but also a very experienced person. So he told me at that presentation that the one thing that investors rarely pay attention to is social change. So social change such as, for example, when people stop smoking all of a sudden, or like we're going through right now, when people stop buying gasoline-driven cars. So those are big changes. You can call it zeitgeist changes, social changes. They're changes that are very difficult to predict and quantify, of course, but nevertheless, there are signals that you can pick up when they happen. And I think right now this is happening as we speak, and Larry Fink is a good canary in the coal mine for that. So I want to talk about his letter. I want to talk about the implications for our portfolio, in particular for Tesla. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's March 26, 2022. This is Crimdelco. For the year, we are down 11.1%. The market is down 4.5%. We're underperforming by 6.6%. Larry Fink, in his letter to CEOs, talks about the end of globalization as we know it. What he means with that is that since the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, we have a different world order. The world order, as it was before, was the one where we had friendly and less friendly governments around the world, following more or less the rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement were such that you invade countries when there is some sort of threat, such as the US invading Iraq. You invade countries when you have a political interest, such as Syria, and people maybe are upset and this and that. But overall, we kind of tolerate this. What we don't tolerate is a unilateral declaration of war into an independent country for no reason other than power reach. And this is what Putin did with the Ukraine. So he broke the world order. I can also, just as a side note, there's a very good book by Henry Kissinger about that, The World Order. And I'm going to try to talk about this a little bit, but let's stay with Larry Fink for now. So he says that because of that, we have an end to the world order as we know it, and we have a new world order, and this new world order is going to be characterized by, this is now my words, let's call it selective globalization. So we'll still have a division of labor, globalization, and trade, but it's going to be very selective. We're going to think twice if we want to build a factory in the Ukraine or in, let's say, Thailand or whatever. We're going to think more strategically, more geopolitically, versus in the past we kind of assumed that buying commodities from Russia, building stuff in Vietnam, and then shipping it around the world to the markets in Europe and the US, that was okay. We will change that attitude. How we will change, Larry Fink doesn't necessarily talk about it. All he's saying is it will change and it will be more selective. That's what he's saying. Now, let's leave it at that. I don't think we want to now try to conjecture. Actually, he says another thing. He says it's unpredictable. So I think let's leave it at that. Those are the facts that are written down in the letter. I want to now bring in Henry Kissinger in his book. I think it's called World Order. He talks about sort of how the world changed over the centuries and how world order was created. For example, he mentions the 30-year War and the peace of, I forgot, some German city, Mainz maybe, or something like that. There was a peace accord, and the peace accord basically meant that what you want to do in Europe, this is now we're talking sort of 17th century Europe, what you want to have is always a couple of countries bonding together to prevent one country to start war. So this was kind of the idea to prevent what was the 30-year war, which was a very bad war in those days. Then we go on, we have World War I and II. World War II is characterized by the win of the US and the communist Soviet Union and the stalemate, the nuclear stalemate, which created the world order that we have today. And the world order that we have today is characterized by, number one, nuclear stalemate. So we don't expect the large powers to go ever against each other head to head. And second, we have this idea that we can buy stuff from anywhere and produce it anywhere we want, and then sell it wherever it needs to be sold. So this was kind of the world order that we had, and now this has changed. And the reason it has changed is because somebody broke the rule. And when somebody breaks the rule, typically what happens is that you have two problems. One, that particular person broke the rule, so we have to fix that, which is what we're doing right now with Russia and the sanctions. But more importantly, of course, it's creating a precedent. So if Putin breaks the rule, well, why shouldn't Xi Jinping break the rule? And why shouldn't XYZ break the rule? And so on and so forth. So this is, of course, a problem that needs to be addressed. And the way these problems get to be addressed typically is by either kinetic war or economic war or both. And of course, the verbal war, the PR war, and all those sort of things. So that's where we stand right now. And what Larry Fink is saying is, again, we have a change in the world order. Now, let's stay with that. Let's say we at Orange Capital Partners, we assume that we have a change in world order. And the change in world order is actually going towards something that we have been investing in for years. Now, this, before I go on, I want to caveat this. Of course, it's a little bit dangerous to have confirmation bias, which means that anything happens in the world, I always feel like, well, this was exactly what I predicted, right? So I want to make sure that that's not what we're doing here. I also want to make sure, this is even more important, that we don't neglect the massive risks that are associated with this change in world order. But having said that, I want to, nevertheless, I think we are exactly on the path that we've been for years. The reason we've been on this path is the following. What is happening in the short term now is a derationalization of the economy. This is just another word for what Larry Fink is saying. We have a selective globalization. Again, selective globalization, these are my words, not his words, but that's how I interpret his letter. What that just means is that we will still trade with Europe, we will trade with Southeast Asia, but we'll be more selective. We will think twice about investing in countries, maybe because we don't trust the countries or we don't trust their neighbors. So like Taiwan could be an example where we might trust them, but we just don't trust China. And we don't want to have too many assets exposed to that risk. So what we have is a derationalization. In short, means we don't want to buy anything from Russia anymore. So what that means is we have to decarbonize the economy, and this is exactly what Tesla has been doing, decarbonizing the economy, getting the power from solar, storing it, and then distributing it through either distributed solar or bringing it back to the net and then using it for housing and, of course, most importantly, for transportation. This is the most important thing. Now, I want to add one more thing that very few people talk about, and this is an innovation that we had here in Orange Capital Partners recently, and this is that actually the manufacturing itself. The manufacturing has been something that Elon Musk has been touting for years now. The machine that builds the machine. Manufacturing is the hard part. Building stuff at scale is hard. Now, we've always interpreted that as some sort of, well, you know, people produce in Romania, in Thailand, in Chattanooga, and in Wolfsburg, and there's some better way to produce stuff. But what this means in the context of the Larry Fink letter is also, well, how can we produce efficiently at home, for example? How about that? How about we ask the question, why is it so expensive to produce stuff in California? And the answer to that question has been given by Tesla, which is, well, it is expensive, but it's doable. And it's doable in certain ways. For example, most importantly, during the COVID times, they wanted to shut down the Fremont factory, and they fought against the shutdown, which was, in our view, arbitrary by the sheriff department of Fremont and the county there, Alameda County. What that means in particular is that a lot of the expenses that we have here in the United States in particular, particularly on the in the coastal states, they are man-made. They are regulatory of nature. For example, this arbitrary shutdown of a factory, which is of course not very good for business, but it's a lot more than that. For example, the housing restrictions in California make it so expensive to live here. So therefore, we have to start changing that. And if we start thinking along those lines, we all of a sudden find solutions to this selective globalization problem. I don't have all the solutions here at my fingertips, but I can say that a lot of the stuff that Tesla has been doing, going to places like Texas, and the next gigafactory will most likely be in a state similar to Texas, because it is not the geography, it is not the weather or things like that. It is most often it is the regulatory environment that defines the cost of production, and the regulatory environment in certain areas of the United States and for that matter also of the Western world. So let's include Germany for that and the rest of Europe. The regulatory environment is often very hostile, and we need to change that. The NIMBY concept needs to be rethought. This is what Larry Fink is saying without saying it. This is our interpretation. NIMBY is a luxury we cannot afford anymore, because Russia has shown us that NIMBY can be turned into a boomerang. Yeah, we don't want to have gas and oil and all that dirty stuff and nuclear power. We don't want to have any of that stuff. Let it be done in the Ukraine and Russia. Well, guess what? If they start misbehaving, all of a sudden we have a very clean environment here, but we don't have an economy to run because we don't have energy, and we don't want that either. So in other words, we have to rethink the NIMBY. And I think this is exactly what Tesla has been doing without saying it really. Tesla has been not just decarbonizing the economy and de-Russianizing the economy, but Tesla is also solving the NIMBY problem. Tesla is saying, look, you can produce in Berlin, in Austin. We can do it in a civilized way. We can use water, we can use electricity, we can use all that stuff and still be a good citizen of the community, create jobs. And this is, in our view, the biggest innovation that Tesla is actually bringing to the table in this new world of of selective globalization. I wanted to bring this out in this episode because I think this is a pivotal moment in world history, in economic history, and in the history of Tesla. Tesla is at the forefront of this movement, not just with the assets that it's producing along the lines of having electric cars and power walls and solar, but also with the mindset of, listen, NIMBY is not so bad. In fact, we have a choice between NIMBY and Putin. Which one do you want? And the answer has been unequivocally, we want the NIMBY problem solved because we don't want Putin. The world has chosen not to want Putin. And I would say that there's a slight different interpretation that we have here at Orange Capital Partners when it comes to the Zeitgeist. The Zeitgeist has been formed before this invasion through the pandemic. The pandemic clearly has been a massive, massive influence on the Zeitgeist in many ways, in the Western world particularly. And what the Zeitgeist has been doing, or now I talk about Zeitgeist as if it's a person, but let's just call Zeitgeist sort of a collective consciousness, collective conscious of at least the Western world. Let's leave it at the Western world for now. What happened is two things. One is we had a very quick adaptation of rules and regulations around the world. It was unanimously accepted to stop travel, to put masks, to do vaccines, all that stuff. A lot of it not exactly to our liking, but nevertheless, it was done very quick around the world. And the same happened with the sanctions. A lot of self-sanctioning also happened during the pandemic. Companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, for example, started forcing people to do vaccines. And again, maybe it's not good what they did, and there's a lot of controversy about that. But nevertheless, there was a lot of privatization of sanctions. And the same happened also after the Russia invasion. In other words, we had a sort of a prelude to this. And the Zeitgeist has been around the world that we do think in blocks. That's true. That is something Larry Fink says. And those blocks are kind of formed around the Western world and add to that actually a lot of countries that you wouldn't think, even China, in our opinion, is part of that bloc. So the selective globalization is actually, it's in one, on one way it's selective, and it does not include Russia, Serbia, Belarus, and that's about it, because those countries are openly pro-Russia. But then the rest of the world is, I would say, all part of this other bloc that we are part of. And the reason for that is because we all want to play the game. I just watched, for other reasons completely unrelated, a couple of interviews with the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and I just noticed that, let's say Jamaica is a small country in the Caribbean. They want to participate in the world economy. They want to grow. They want to be prosperous. They don't have this. There's some issues with slavery. I mean, of course, past slavery and sort of their version of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is all good, and it should be discussed. But this country really wants to go towards prosperity, and I think it's just a small example of a bigger picture that everybody out there wants to win, wants to participate and compete and win in their way. So, and this is really what globalization is about. But it's going to be selective, which means that in order to be accepted, and these are the words of Larry Fink, in order to have access to the global financial markets, and you can replace global financial markets with pretty much anything else, global trade, global safety, security, all these things. In order to have access to that, you need to play by the rules. And people have an incentive to play by the rules because they will find ways to win in their particular niche, like a person that competes in the labor market. That's how countries compete in the global trade market. And I think this is a good thing. Of course, this is very good for anybody who invests capital in the global markets. And I think it's also good for freedom and liberty. And we've said many times on this podcast that wealth creation is, the measure of wealth is freedom, and freedom is necessary for wealth creation. So these are, of course, the fundamental premises of our operation and of the way we think and our principle stack. And it does apply also to hopefully what we believe will become the global setup, or this selective globalization of the future. Now, having said all of that, of course, we need to also caveat everything, because there is risk. There is risk of a nuclear war. There's risk that China invades Taiwan. So yes, this can go wrong. We are at a crossing point. We are at a fickle point of global history, because things could go wrong. And that's why the markets are jittery and volatile, because China could be doing something that we don't expect. We could have terrorism. We could have things that happen that are unexpected and bad. And the likelihood of these types of things happening is higher in a world where we have change and zeitgeist change, because not everybody changes their zeitgeist at the same time. What gives me hope is that because we had, as I said, this prelude with the pandemic, where everybody kind of in tandem started applying rules and regulations around the world, that this will happen, that people will adopt rules across the world, for example, sanctions to Russia, and play by the rules, that this will actually happen more easier. So in a way, we have globalization, we have, of course, countries having self-governance and all that, and relying on their own we want to decide what's up in our own place. But we're also happy to apply international rules in order to be able to compete in the global market. So to summarize, we're discussing Larry Fink's letter to CEOs. We're discussing the selective globalization. We believe that our portfolio is incredibly well positioned, particularly through Tesla, because we have Tesla as a forerunner of all of these things, and in particular, a new thing that hasn't been discussed as much, which is the NIMBY problem needs to be rethought, and Tesla has been putting a lot of emphasis on manufacturing and of overcoming the NIMBY problem. So therefore, we believe that this is also another vector where Tesla is at the forefront of the next couple of years in global financial markets. Thank you.